I'd like to talk to you today about my book, A Planet of 3 Billion, and quickly cover 85,000 words, 1.2 million years in human history, and see if there's any thoughts within it that might be useful to you in your meetings today. 50 years ago, we landed on the moon, and that gave us an opportunity to see our planet from space. And at that moment, because of the looks of 70% ocean and the swirly nature of our land, we coined the term the blue marble. And that is one of the most iconic views we have of our planet. The other one is of the political borders that we have in all of the globes that we have in our classrooms and in our homes. We buy these globes because it helps educate our children about the world around them. But these globes are focused on the political borders. Which countries are bigger than the others? What countries' borders were fought in this war or the other war? But I would argue that that view of the planet is, unfortunately, skips over some of the most important aspects, which is the historic wildernesses that comprise our planet. These are the historic wildernesses, the ecoregions that, from which we evolved. These are the ecoregions that provide the ecosystems and goods and services that have supported the rise of our many human civilizations. And unfortunately, this is not the globe that we use to raise our children and our grandchildren, but it is the view that we should be raising our next generations on, because they then need to understand how we have burdened our planet. This is a set of data that I will go into later in my talk, but these many colors are humanity's footprint on those historic ecoregions where we have deleted those ecosystem goods and services, deleted many parts of those wildernesses that have supported us as a species, or further burdened them with our wide range of wastes. But first, I'd like to start with, how did we get here? How could we possibly have burdened our planet ecologically in such a profound way? And I'd like to take an abbreviated version of this video from the American Museum of Natural History with 100,000 years of human history. And you'll look at 100,000 BCE, where humanity only had about 1 million of us as part of the species. And it took till well past 10,000 BCE before organized farming and civilization allowed for the growth of our population to around 170 million at 1 AD. And at 1 AD, or as I like to say, at the birth of Jesus, you already had large populations in China and in India with the introduction of the plow and the introduction of organized agricultural methods and organized administrative agricultural states that could actually sustain this size of population. And that goes well before 1 AD, in some cases a couple thousand years earlier. And it's not like nothing was going on when we had 170 million people on this planet. You already had the Han Dynasty, you already had the Roman Empire doing all these amazing things and all the Roman literature that you may have learned in school. You had the Silk Road moving goods and services and talent and people across all of the Eurasian continent. You had the Mayan culture over here, largely separated from everything going on, the birth of Islam, gunpowder invented out in the East. And still, you only had 250 million people on the planet. And it's not that population always crept up on a steady basis. At around 1300, as many of you know, you actually had the bubonic plague sweep across Eurasia, and you had a swift decline in populations to the extent that you actually had forests regrow across Europe in many places because there weren't populations there to consistently chop down trees for shelter and for fuel and to warm their food. You had spread of transatlantic trade, but around 1700, you actually had industrialization, agricultural revolutions, scientific revolution, introduction of medicine, which is all great and the source of great human progress. But at some point, I think we can all agree that the slope of that curve became problematic. And I'll let you choose for yourself when you think that the number became problematic. But also remember, the slope of that curve in many ways characterizes an inexorable trend that you are along for a while. So that you may ask yourself the question, at what point did we go off the rails? But I'd like you to ask a different question. How many people can the Earth support? This book by Joel Cohen actually inspired his inaugural lecture for the Earth Institute in the mid-1990s that as a young man I was present for. And this is the question that has haunted me for more than 2 decades. How many people can the Earth support? And I would encourage you to actually ask yourself, how many people do you think the Earth can support? And more importantly, this is, I think, the question that you should be asking yourself in the morning, in the evening before you go to bed, and ask all of your friends and colleagues during the day. And weirdly, it turns out to be a great starter for a conversation at parties. But one might ask, how many people can the Earth support in what sense? What is the Earth that you're talking about? So I'd like to go back to these ecoregions. And in a short video, give you a little tour because there are hundreds of these. And there's a website in my book that you can go to, Google Ecoregions 2017, and you can read about the many hundreds of them. But they are unique places where flora and fauna, singular flows of water, climate, elevation, play together to provide unique places. And when a species goes extinct, they go extinct in a specific place. There are no polar bears in the Kalahari. So it is important to understand that when we burden our planet with the activities of human civilization, we're burdening specific places on the planet that have provided us those historical ecological resources, those wildernesses that have sustained us. Because on top of that, we have gone and created a massive human footprint. And I'd like to have you reflect upon the day that you've already had. You've probably talked about your carbon footprint in many, many ways, right? Because we talk about that in the context of climate change. But our carbon footprint is actually just a small portion of the larger human footprint that we collectively have foisted on top of our planet. And I think it's important to understand human footprint in 2 categories. One is the industrialization of our global landscape, where we have created machines that mill our Earth's surface, mow our Earth's surface, cut things down on our Earth's surface every single day. And year after year, we have more of those machines and more people who are in the business of doing that to support human progress. But we also have a process of creating a massive geography of human waste that goes to the deepest trenches of the ocean, to the highest heights of our atmosphere, and to the furthest frontiers. And I think it's important to go into this in a little bit of detail, partially because it's gory, but I'm going to start with going back to our topic for today, which is climate change, where I like to say climate change, twice as bad as you think, and only 1/10 of the problem. And after a long day talking about the vast consequences of climate change, you may find that just a little horrifying to hear me characterize it that way. But again, your carbon footprint is only a small piece of your larger human footprint. So let's explore this a little more deeply. So we'll begin again with atmospheric carbon. We can talk about those curves and how we've passed 350 parts per million. But the only reason those curves are not as bad as they could be is because our oceans have absorbed so much of that carbon, leading to the acidification of our oceans. And while we can talk about the impacts of that on our reefs, it's perhaps more important to understand that the acidification of our ocean is actually fundamentally changing the pH for our phytoplankton to live, and our oceans with our phytoplankton actually generate 80% of our planet's oxygen budget. So when you think about this, it's probably twice as bad as most people think. Once you deplete all oxygen for humanity to survive on, it's not just about sea level rise and things like that. But this, I would argue, is just 1/10 of the larger footprint problem, because it's through the chopping down of all the trees since the last glaciation of 16,000 years ago, where we've cut down nearly every tree, again, for a place to live, for shelter, for heat, and for cooking. Yes, we moved from trees then to coal, and from coal then to oil, which has changed our landscape, our global landscape, in fundamental ways. Now on to fracking. Agriculture, you saw in that spinning globe large black kind of splotches across the continents where we have engaged in intensive agriculture. And I come from an agricultural family actually here in Florida. So I'm not anti-agriculture, but we must recognize that every acre of agriculture used to be a piece of historic wilderness that we've cleared out in order to feed ourselves. And at some point we have exceeded that as a piece that has helped us exceed a carrying capacity of our planet. Manufacturing is something. We've built factories all over the planet, in many cases as close to these natural resources required for the manufacturing process as possible, which has often led to many factories that are now just skeletons that have gone out of business after we've exhausted those resources. Infrastructure, in many cases, whether you call them superhighways or rail or many other kinds of infrastructure, have bisected, transected historic wildernesses in ways that have ceased to allow biological transfer or even the flow of water in the ways that actually sustain that historic ecoregion. And then urbanization. You have to understand that every city that you live in involves a lot of concrete and a lot of asphalt and a lot of impermeable surfaces that have deleted the historic eco-region resources that were there. But it is a double-edged sword, because the more people we can fit into these urban environments, the less we have to have them in less dense development strategies out there deleting the historic ecological resources that we have. So urbanization, which is a process by 2050 is likely to include 75% of our planet's population, a population that is to grow at least another 2 billion by then. Urbanization is perhaps the most ecologically friendly strategy that we can have for development. But then I want to reflect a little more on human waste to get to those 10 things, right? Climate change, twice as bad as you think, but only 1/10 of the problem. We have those ocean dead zones, which were first discovered in the 1970s. Where there's not enough dissolved oxygen in the Baltic Sea to sustain marine life in certain patches. And once that was telegraphed out to their scientific colleagues, it was discovered that more than 400 ocean dead zones exist now. And that, with ocean acidification on high season, can comprise 1/10 of the world's oceans being incapable of sustaining marine life. There's also persistent toxicity. In that spinning globe, you probably saw a bunch of purple dots. And those dots are, think of an EPA Superfund site, but all across the globe. Well, there's 3 kinds of persistent toxicity. There are heavy metals, there's radioactive materials, and then there are endocrine disruptors. Everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with Rachel Carson's watershed book, Silent Spring, which helped kick off the environmental awakening of the mid-20th century, late 20th century. But she only talked about one endocrine disruptor. Our endocrine system in plants and animals governs our development, our growth, and our ability to reproduce. And DDT, which is the one endocrine disruptor she identified, undermined the ability of many birds and reptiles to reproduce. But she was only talking about one of what we know to be thousands of endocrine disruptors that exist today, and growing at an alarming rate. Noise pollution is something we don't like to really focus on. It sounds a little weak to some people, but you have to understand that biological resources, our animals in particular, use sound to navigate, to reproduce, and to hunt. And when humans operate on their frequencies, it turns out they're unable, in many cases, to do what they need to do. And then ocean garbage, I think, is a good way to round out these 10, where it wasn't until 1996 that we discovered 5 continent-sized ocean garbage patches. And this was an American captain named Captain Moore, going across the Pacific, and recognized just the sheer density of all of the trash. And it's been now a quarter century since then, and as humanity, we've by and large done absolutely nothing. So this human footprint on these ecoregions that I've discussed, these historic wildernesses, is quite profound. The red for the urban development, the black, the gray roads for primary roads. These aren't the secondary roads, all the roads we drive on every day, because at this scale it would make the entire map black. You've got all of the purple for the toxic sites, the yellow ocean dead zones. These are just 5 layers, not even going into the full panoply of humanity's long history of burdening our planet ecologically. So you might ask, how could we possibly have gotten here? How could we not have noticed? Well, it turns out we all suffer from a disease called the shifting baseline syndrome. And it's actually a syndrome coined by a fisheries scientist, Daniel Pauly, in the mid-1990s. I encourage you to Google his TED Talk on this. But it isn't about fish. Yes, he was focused on, you know, why did Grandpa used to be able to pick, he would say he got fish this big, right? And then over time, they got smaller and smaller. Grandpa must have been crazy. Well, Grandpa might have been crazy, but it turns out that we have many instances of shifting baselines where our natural resources, the baseline that we were living with in a previous generation, has fundamentally shifted. But you coming in as a younger person, you become familiar with that baseline. And when you think about the degradation of ecological resources, you're thinking off of your baseline, not the previous more rich baseline. So how did we get here? Well, the person that actually coined the term biodiversity, E.O. Wilson, a Harvard professor, recently, 3 years ago, did a book called Half Earth. And his reflection is, we've gotten here and we don't understand that we need at least half of those historic wildernesses, those biological resources, to sustain us as a species. And while he was a biologist and not a geographer, many of his colleagues launched into try to understand geographically those places that could be brought back to 50% of the wilderness or the historic resources set aside from humanity. And it turns out it's quite tough. Whether you agree with the methodology or not, we have the red areas that are imperiled. Yellow could recover back to 50%. The green could reach half. And the dark green, these small spots, are actually half protected. Notice there is no color saying 100% protected because there's no place on Earth that is. So this human footprint that we have on our historic wildernesses is quite profound and far exceeds our carbon footprint, and we need to think about what to do about that. I would argue, after surveying the literature, that we can actually only support 3 billion humans, the equivalent of what we had in 1950, living at kind of modern industrial levels of quality of life. And I won't get into all the math and all the discussion here, but I think we need not to be asking, how can we just we should not just be asking how can we decarbonize. We should be asking how many people fundamentally can the Earth support, since our footprint is much larger than our carbon footprint. So what could we do? What must we do? So very quickly, I'd say, obviously, we need to bend that global population curve. We need to take it, instead of at 7.7, growing at 85 million a year, which is the equivalent of 10 New York cities added to the world population every year. We need to bend that population curve downward. And while it's a difficult thing, it's a complex thing, it turns out it's quite simple in a way, because we know that every place where women are empowered, educated, integrated in the workforce, and have access to family planning technology, every geography where that exists, the population is below replacement value, the fertility rate is. So that's something we need to do. We also need to reinvent how we think about economics, because we've seen these breathless accounts in many of the newspapers, whether it's the Financial Times or in Wall Street Journal or even the Washington Post, that will say, but we must have an endless stream of people to have economic growth. And it turns out GDP is perhaps the worst measure you can have for understanding quality of life in your country. Instead, you should be focused on perhaps per capita GDP, productivity growth, per capita wealth and well-being. But the way we think about economics as a global society is fundamentally incapable of allowing us to navigate to a more sustainable population plateau. We also need to deindustrialize our global landscape and rewild it. As I said, for instance, with factories, we have these exoskeletons of capitalism's past, where we've done useful development for a lot of good reasons, but it is no longer something that we use actively. And it turns out with the fourth agricultural revolution and many of these new technologies and capabilities that are out there, we have the ability to actually sustain not only our current population level with a much smaller geographic footprint, but if we bend that curve, we can allow our planet to bounce back. But as we do that, we also have to remember that massive weight of human waste that we have foisted on our planet, and come up with novel strategies that will be massively energy intensive to possibly gather up all of that waste and deal with it in some way. As I always like to say, it's much harder to clean up your house than it was to mess it up in the first place. We must pay down this ecological debt before it comes due. Think about the loan shark. Not that any of you have ever taken a loan from a loan shark, but when you do, you must pay it off before they break your knees or perhaps kill you. And frankly, that's the most operative metaphor I've been able to come up with. But most importantly, we must ask ourselves every moment of every day, when we wake up in the morning until we go to bed at night, and all of our friends and colleagues that we speak with, how many people do you believe that the Earth can support? Because in my opinion, this constitutes the single biggest cultural blind spot that we have as a planet and as a globalist civilization to keep us from actually tackling the large issues that we face together in rebalancing our species with our planet's natural resources. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I wish I were there for the opportunity for Q&A, because that's my favorite part of these talks. But perhaps I'll have an opportunity to meet you all in the near future. Thank you very much.